What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? We've been in the book of James the last few weeks, and we already know that James is a very high challenge writer. James talks about a faith that can save him. So what's that look like? What do you think of when James talks about works? What comes to mind? What type of works in the church or in ministry or your life do you see? Certain activities, and I'm asking you to be very specific. I want you to think about, while we're going through this sermon for the next half hour, think about what activities, what ways that you can get involved come to mind. And I'm praying that the Spirit's going to lead you in a way, because those are the works that James is going to talk about, and James is going to call you out in the faith. If we have a quarter, which I forgot to grab one, but on a quarter you have two sides, right? You have the heads and you have tails. And if you flip a quarter, you get tails. You know the other side's heads. But that's just like faith and works. You know one side is faith and the other side's works. It's not about, and I'm not, the flipping metaphor, don't go with that. But what I'm saying is a coin, you know both sides. A coin, you know one side's heads and one side's tails. Just like your faith. One side's faith, one side's works, but they're both together on the same coin. And James is going to challenge us to be a coin. To be both. As hard or as easy as that may come. To challenge us. So verse 14, I'll reread it. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith, but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? I mean, really, what good is that? Somebody comes to you needing something to be clothed, to be filled with food, and you're just like, go be clothed and filled, not extending the hand. But don't we do that in some way or another? In Chicago, at school, there was just homeless people always on the sides of the streets, and you eventually have to start telling them no. You just can't. Because there's so many, they just want something. They always want cash or they want something. But then there's every now and then you'd be walking by someone, they'd be like, can I have some? And you're just like, no. And then you get this gut feeling, at least for me. I'd get this gut feeling, I'm like, I should help them. And you just keep walking, you just keep moving on, but that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm telling them no when the Spirit's convicted me to do something. I'm telling them to go, be warm, and be peace, and be filled. Those verses are an example of faith without works. Verse 17. So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. I think we know James enough at this point, about halfway through the book, that James is bold. James says faith 3 times in those last 4 verses. Each time he uses the word faith, it isn't the faith that he's telling us to have. In verse 14, if someone says he has faith but does not have works, can that faith save him? See, he's not talking about the faith that we should be striving for. He's talking about the faith that's dead. And in verse 17, so also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. James is telling us over and over, look at your faith. Faith is an action. It's a verb. It's like a seed that's planted in the dirt, and it grows up into a plant. You see, the faith is the seed that's planted, and the works is the plant that grows out of it. One of the commentaries I was reading, it says, James is not saying that faith is dead until works are added to it. On the contrary, faith is only alive if it naturally produces a plant. You see, you can put a seed in the ground, but if you buy a tomato seed and you put it in the ground and you go buy a tomato plant and put the tomato plant on top, that seed didn't grow into a plant. You've simply added more to it, and that's not faith and works. James is striving, is calling us out to have faith that is the seed that grows up into a mature plant. Throughout reading this, I thought of Martin Luther. And if you don't know who Martin Luther is, he's the father of the Reformation, 16th century. One of the pastors I was listening to says, besides knowing the first century and the birth of the church, knowing the 16th century is the next best. That's the century of the Reformation for Martin Luther. He's the father of the Reformation. If you don't know what that is, that's when the church started to break away from the Roman Catholic Church. And they were, in that time period, they were a little more corrupt. And they were making bad decisions as people in power that aren't aligning themselves with Christ might. But Martin Luther spent many years studying, reading, enjoying, and grinding out the word. He built his credibility. Martin Luther has a crazy story, and I'm giving you the real over-top view of his great testimony. But he built his credibility up. For many years, he studied in one of the most rigorous Catholic studies, continuing to study and love the word more and more. He's known for spending days upon days confessing his sins, because that's how the Roman Catholics do it. They would sit in a booth and confess the sins to the Father. He would make up sins to make himself try to be better. But you see this man who was so enriched and so involved in how the Roman Catholics did their worship, that one of the priests actually said, go to Rome and visit, because they had artifacts, they had churches. And so he went and visited, and he came back broken and empty as he saw the corruption that the church had become. And I'm not saying that as how it is now. I'm not making any stance on that. But what I'm saying is, in that time, when Martin Luther saw that, he was distraught. He came back, and he started to think. He had a movement, and he allowed the Spirit to move him. But the tipping point, the straw on the camel's back, is when the church came around selling indulgences. And if you don't know what those are, they would come and say, real basic, is when you die, instead of going to heaven or hell, you go to purgatory and you wait. This is how they believe it. And they would show up, the priest would say, hey, your mom just died, she's in purgatory. Give the church money, and we will guarantee with this little certificate that she goes to heaven. We know that's not biblical. But that's what they were doing. And that's the straw that broke the camel's back. Martin Luther sat down and wrote the 95 Theses. That's 95 unbiblical things that he saw the church doing that he felt that needed addressed and needed to be talked about. He marched down to the main church and nailed it right to the door, so the whole town could see. And that was the start of how we have started to read the Bible from here on out. And that's an airplane view. If you want to talk about it more, I'd love to, because there's a lot to unpack in that. But why did I tell you about Martin Luther? Because whether it's true or not, Martin Luther has said and is credited for saying he wishes James could be taken out of the Bible. The man who started the Reformation said that this book we're reading right now, he wishes could be taken out. And that makes me ask, why? Like, why would he want to take out a Bible? Or why would he want to take out a book of the Bible? You see, Roman Catholics at that time were all, if you think of a pendulum, swings back and forth. Roman Catholics were all about works, all about it. You work to get into heaven, you work to do this. There's no grace. There's no faith. It's just works. And so when Martin Luther stepped away and moved the 95 Theses, he swung to the other side of the pendulum of faith. He felt like James's writings contradicted what Paul had to say. What Paul says in Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. That seems kind of contradictory to what we're reading about faith and works. In Romans 3:28, we see Paul write, For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. One is justified by faith apart from works. I tell you this because when I'm reading Scripture, I ask myself questions. And so when I read James, I'm like, that's not what Paul says. Paul says almost the opposite. But if we read it at face value, it might seem like it's contradicting itself. But if you start to dig in, you start to look and see what James's heart behind it is, you see that it's not contradicting, but it's building. Luther felt like those scriptures contradicted James. As we study more and more, as we've been able to get involved and really learn how to kind of explain it with the seed. The seed grows into a plant. It's not about planting more seeds and keep planting seeds, but it's about allowing your faith to grow and mature. In verse 18, we start with but. And every time a but starts a verse, it's a biblical but, which means tune in. You got to lean in a little bit when you see that because something's about to be said. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You see, James isn't saying go do works to not have faith, but he's saying have faith that have grown into works, producing fruit. He lays it out logically precise. He's also challenging us all at the same time. It lets us be real and alive in our faith. Verse 19. You believe that God is one. You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. I love the book of James. I don't know if I've said that already. I read it. It's one of those books that I read every week, the whole freshman year at Moody. I love it. I don't know what it is. I think it's the high challenge, the calling out. Next week's Taming the Tongue. I love that verse. I love that section of Scripture. But one that's always caught my eyes, verse 19. Even the demons believe and shudder. So believing, that's not what James says. We don't stop. You don't say, I believe and stop right there. You say, I believe and you do more. You do the works. He uses this to really drive it home. That just because, believing is the first step, but the demons stopped after that. Believing is continuing to take the steps to work through it. So this is the difference between having correct theology and genuine living. You can have all the right answers. You can say what needs to be said, but if you're not genuinely living it out, James is calling you to do that better. The demons have a dead faith. Just the same dead faith that James talks about earlier in the Scripture. In verse 17, so also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. It always just caught my attention and just struck me. In verse 20, do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? He continues to just dig in, calling you a foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless. It almost feels kind of condescending. He's like talking down to you, but he's not. He's trying to grip your attention to really allow you to tune in. James leads into the next verse with an example of the Old Testament, one that the whole nation that's reading this book would know. And I don't know, I did miss the first week, so I don't know how much you got into the history, but James is one of the first books of the Bible, of the New Testament, I should say that. One of the first New Testament books. And so he's writing to the scattered believers, the broken church. And as he's writing, he's using references. In the next five or so verses, he uses two different references. And that is Abraham and Rahab, of which the nation would know through the generations. So verse 21, was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. You see, James, by using the word completed, we see Abraham's seed grew into a plant. It was an active, growing, nurturing faith. Abraham followed the call of God, and 30, 40 years later, put his son on the altar. And through those years, he continued to mature in his faith, to take steps. And maybe you didn't see the works that were in his life, but when God called him to do those works, he was right there ready to do them. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You see, Abraham's faith grew into a plant. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. James is reminding us of the urgency to do works, not on top of, but to produce fruit. The same thing if you can't put a tomato seed in the ground and go buy an already grown tomato plant, stick it on top and say, my seed grew. You just can't. You have to allow that seed to grow. You have to allow the roots to spread for it to eventually peek up through the soil and then grow. Verse 25. And in the same way, was not Rahab also the prostitute, justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? He uses another example to drive home the fact that she had faith and works, that she did what Christ called and followed him. It's not about finding busy work. It's not about doing everything you can to put more and more on top of yourself, but it's about allowing the Spirit to move through you. Sorry, I thought that was falling off. To move through you and allowing him to walk you the steps that need to be walked. Christ's ministry was only 3 years, but he lived for 33 years, and for 30 years, he didn't do very much ministry, if any. But those 3 years were the most impactful 3 years of the entire world. It took him 3 years of faithful following to do. He didn't load busy work up on himself, but he allowed God to work through him when he was called. When the Spirit prompts you, when he leads you, to allow yourself to let your faith that may just be a seed still grow into a plant when asked. Verse 26. For as the body apart from the Spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. That's hard. Sometimes I read James, and I'm excited that I'm reading James, and sometimes I read James, and I'm like, wow, that's a big pill to swallow. Because he's asking us, he's calling us out to do more. He's telling us that works gives the energy to faith. Allowing the Spirit to move through your life gives you what you need to continue working in your faith. Real faith is a verb that's to go and do. It's active. It's alive. As you learn more about God, see, these two things feed off each other. As you learn more about God, you want to go do more. And as you do more, you'll realize, I don't know that much about God. And you'll want to learn more about God. And it's a constant back and forth that's just awesome. As you continue to do and learn, as you sit in these seats to learn, you want to go do. And as you do, you're like, I need more. So you come back to the scriptures to learn more, to love the Lord more. A great quote is, man is not justified by faith alone. That is, by a bare and empty knowledge of God. He is justified by works, that is, his righteousness is known and proved by its fruits. John Calvin wrote that. Tells us that our faith is known and proven by their fruits. So I asked you at the start, what comes into mind? Does anything particular come into mind as this 20 minutes? Does anything come to mind? Has the Spirit pulled on your heart at all? One of the great things about only preaching a few times is you guys get out earlier, so I'm almost done. Take the 15 minutes and run. So I'm going to ask the singers to come back up. But with that, there's been times I'm in the car driving, and I see someone on the side of the road. And I think, maybe I should help them. But I don't. I just keep driving. I just keep going. And I pass them. I'm like, shoot. Guts just knots. I'm like, I should have pulled over and asked them if they needed help. And maybe they would have said no. I have no idea. But that feeling of driving up seeing who needs help, and continuing on. Just like I did to the homeless people in Chicago, the person that I felt God was prompting me to do. I kept my seed in the ground instead of allowing it to grow into a plant. And so I hope and I pray that if God's tugging on your heart, if he's trying to water your seed and you're not allowing the water to hit your seed, to grow into a plant, that you can allow that water, to allow his prompting, his working, his moving to do what you need to do, to allow your faith to grow into a plant, to produce fruit, as glorious as it is.